The, Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, the title of my thesis is A Literal-Legal Study of Dystopia, a Panoptic View. So before I go into the details of my thesis, I would like to start with the context with which I approach this endeavor of getting into PhD. Since I had already had the experience of representing various clients in various courts of law before entering into PhD, I was always interested in studying the interconnections between law and literature, because while I was studying law, we used to have a subject called legal English, which was English, but it had a lot of jargons that were specifically annotated with literary contexts, but had certain specific uses in law. So this interconnection always interested me, because whenever as a student I used to ask my teachers about the literary questions that they tried to put in context to through the Latin languages that we used to talk about, we found that this was lacking. So what happened was, teachers were telling us how to draft something, how to become a good lawyer in a court of law, practice courtcraft, but they were not aware of the context with which law and literature come together. So, so with that aspect, I found a book during my research which was based on Richard Posner's idea of law as literature and literature as law. Basically, it tried to delve into the interconnections between law as literary text and literature as a legal fiction. So that was the point of interest for me, which actually initiated me into this direction. So with this context, uh, I approached Nandini ma'am, and she was very gracious enough to give me that chance to pursue my research. And this endeavor finally culminated into this research thesis entitled A Literal Legal Study of Dystopia, a Panoptic View. So this title is divided into three or four important words that are sort of literary canons in themselves. First, what is a panopticon? So before I talk about my chapters, I would like to talk a little bit about these keywords. What is a panopticon? So panopticon is a structure, is a design by a legal scholar named Jeremy Bentham, who designed a prison for for inmates, where the design was such that a guard could see everybody in each and every respective cell, but the people or the inmates could not see who was observing them. So this view has been borrowed as a trope in my thesis, and it is actually being used to analyze the relation between state and the individual and the state in matters of private law, and specifically the same is being done to understand how the idea of the interaction between state and the individual happens on a day-to-day basis in the issues of public policy vis-a-vis the idea of civil liberties. The second keyword is dystopia. Dystopia is a misnomer, because in the starting, Thomas More gave a concept of an utopia, an ideal world, an ideal island where everything was perfect and everything worked according to a certain set of discourse already set by the elders of that society, which was basically an island. So with the passage of time, these ideas were borrowed in different contexts by different writers, specifically science fiction writers, in explaining all the anomalies that were occurring in our society through power politics, through the ambitions of uh, gaining authority over one another. And in the context of Second World War, the element of dystopian studies gained prominence when two important writers, who are incidentally the writers of my two important key subjects, wrote their work. The two works that I talk about are part of my main topic that I would like to explain upon right here. So before I get into it, the title is a literal-legal study of dystopia. So what is a literal-legal study of dystopia? A literal-legal study of dystopia, according to me, is a study which is based on the legal texts as the literary canons, reflecting on the element of law in literature, where I consider the theoretical aspects of law vis-a-vis the elements of popular literary theories. So, for example, if somebody talks about corporeality, somebody talks about surveillance, I try to find an interaction, a space of interaction between both of them as to how bodies are actually surveilled. How do I construct a vulnerability? How do I construct a vulnerable or an insecure subject? How these insecure subjects behave in a world where there is mass surveillance? How state tends to interfere and tries to dominate upon the individual rights, how social rights are affected by the legislations that are passed, and how the civil society and the elements of civil liberties are negotiated by the citizens through organized protests or through mass dissents or through individual elements of protests. So the first chapter the first chapter deals with introduction, where I talk about defining a literal legal study, the theoretical framework. And herein the theoretical framework that I have decided was obviously cultural studies, because it gave me the freedom to incorporate a lot of different disciplines and their theories without any constraint. Because when I was looking for something else that could have suited my purpose, I realized that either I'll have to make my thesis strictly legal or it will become literary, which has always been the case with the text that I have taken. I'm extremely sorry I couldn't mention the text. My three texts are 1984, Brave New World, and Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange. So these three texts are seminal texts when we study about dystopian literature. But when as a law student somebody tries to analyze the elements of these three texts, we realize that there is always a kind of a gap between the literary imagination of these texts and the interpretation that is done through the lens of these texts, and the legal aspects of courtcraft that is there in the courtroom, or the matters that are decided by the lens of the issues that are discussed in these novels. So we often refer to elements of 1984, such as the big brother is watching you, there is newspeak, there is the element of double think, there is the element of ruling party wielding power enough so that they could erase your memories. And these are tropes which are freely borrowed by all the writers who more or less write within the framework of this literature. So while incorporating the literary element, I tried to bring in the legal element, and I realized that the gap between both the law and the literature as a text, or as a narrative, or as a discourse for that matter, is very wide. In fact, it's so big that people are almost misinformed, and therein lies the research objective of my thesis. I Before I started, I approached this area as an interpretation of one discipline via the other discipline, but ultimately it evolved into the studying of the organic and inorganic society of India, where ultimately through the lens of these three texts I was trying to delineate the arguments that created a society, or that tried to evolve the society through law as a discipline, where literature as a text would feature regularly in landmark judgments. And in context to that, I actually decided to incorporate legal judgments in my thesis, In fact, by the end of my fifth chapter, I had already incorporated 64 different legal judgments, which had different aspects of these interconnections between law and literature, and the literal-legal element of dystopia. And dystopia here is related to anything that one can put under the sun. It can relate to our right as an individual, it can relate to our right as a citizen, it can relate to our right to demand the entitlement of seeking some freebies from the government, the right to a political discourse, right to the procedure of law. It can be anything. And because of the vastness of the expanse that I had undertaken, the study itself became very complicated. So the chapters that I framed were different when I started, but ultimately in the end, I decided to stick with the framework that I had discussed with my supervisor. So the chapters are introduction, wherein I discuss about the literal legal study, its theoretical framework. I then talk about the historiography of the authors. Then I go on to explain the utopia and dystopia together as an action reaction continuum to each other. And then I talk about the objective of the study at the outset itself. Then the second chapter is titled Understanding the Surveillance Culture, Decoding the Panopticons of the Safety Culture. Now, the title itself is a key. So when I talk about the surveillance culture, I tend to talk about everything that happens to the surveilled self, to a body, to a citizen, to somebody who's walking on the road, to somebody who is sitting in his or her private space but still is being surveilled through, let's say, a dragnet or through some device which one is not aware of. So that is why I use the word decoding the panopticons of the safety culture, because inherently everybody seeks some sort of safety either through the element of surveillance, where the subject, when looking at somebody else, wants to see what's happening around, but immediately becomes aware of the fact that he is being watched instantly when the gaze turns inward. So that is why I use this element of panopticon as a trope itself, where the perspectives can be multiple, and anybody or anything for that matter, any object can be something that may be observing you or may be looking at you. And then the third chapter is Understanding the Big Brothers of 1984, Decoding a State. So Understanding the Big Brothers of 1984 is a chapter wherein I talk about my text 1984, but the state of 1984 is in congruence with the state of Brave New World, because ultimately all these states, in some way or the other, use the same tropes in different ways. So, though this chapter deals about 1984 as the main text, but the elements become common, and the text and the chapter becomes intertextual in that sense. And here I talk about the element of Big Brother thought crime vis-a-vis the elements of Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange, where the state is trying to reform a citizen or a group of hooligans who engage in ultra violence, who engage in activities that create anarchy through different techniques. I also talk about Brave New World's hyper masculine state, where everything is being controlled through technology, and the state is still trying to find ingress and limit the individual civil liberties. So this chapter is dedicated to the idea of different conceptions and different denominations of states as to how they function and try to uh, impress upon the individuals or the citizenry. The fourth chapter is Understanding the Ambiguity of the Self as an Individual in the Brave New World. Now, this chapter specifically talks about Brave New World as a subject, but because Brave New World as a text is predominantly talking about the struggle of a society where they are trying to create a rebellion against the state. So, this chapter deals with the element of the self and all the other congruent elements of the self in 1984 as well as in Clockwork Orange. Then the fifth chapter is understanding the social contract, decoding the morality of free will in a Clockwork Orange. Now this text, a Clockwork Orange, is a text which is a little bit different in its nature and its approach, because the writer wanted to create a society or depict a society which was essentially a working class society. So the emphasis of the novel is highly linguistic. The ma'am? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So the conclusion, in the conclusion that I draw, I go back to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World Revisited, wherein he summarizes the idea of the elements of dystopia and this element of panopticons through his brilliant argument. Because as a writer, though he had written something very important and of a very seminal nature, he was ultimately disillusioned by the current state of affairs. So in his last chapter, chapter 12, if my memory serves me correctly, he talks about the element of habeas corpus, and he traces the element of law